And so now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Frances Barlas, Vice President with Ipsos's Knowledge Panel team. Frances, you have the floor.
Great, thank you so much, Ellen. And hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here today to talk to you about representativeness in online surveys and a little bit about our Knowledge Panel. So as Ellen mentioned, I'm Frances Barlas. My pronouns are she and her. I am the head of the Knowledge Panel statistics team. So in my current role, I'm charged with overseeing and advancing the statistical integrity and the operational efficiency of our Knowledge Panel. And I'll be talking to you today a little bit about our Knowledge Panel and how we go about recruiting a diverse and representative set of panelists to take surveys for us. And this is such an important topic right now. If we think about the pace of change that our society has experienced over the last several months, we've seen some really wide changes in attitudes. If we think about some of the attitudes around support for Black Lives Matter and understanding and perceptions of systemic racism that has been occurring, we've seen some really dramatic changes. As well as some changes in demographics. If we think about unemployment rate skyrocketing and changes in income, there's really been some dramatic shifts. And so that means it's very important for us when we think about conducting survey research to make sure that we are capturing the full diversity of voices here in the United States. If we don't work hard to capture diversity, it could lead to some incorrect conclusions. You probably know that there are differential response rates across demographics here in the United States. And so if we don't work hard to recruit diverse samples, we may draw some incorrect conclusions. For example, it's usually easier for us to have females complete surveys. So samples tend to skew towards women, and they tend to skew towards older Americans. And so if we don't really represent males or young males in particular in our surveys, it may lead us to draw some incorrect conclusions about who our general population is, our population of interest, or our customer base, our client base, or perhaps we're not really reflecting the full range of attitudes and opinions of the people we're interested in learning more about. So in today's webinar, we'll talk a little bit about representativeness in research and a little bit about online panels, the different types of online panels that are out there, with a particular focus on Ipsos's Knowledge Panel. We'll show the Knowledge Panel in action, show you some results, as well as how well we do in representing different groups here in the United States and some actions that we take to make sure that we are representing diversity well. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Randall Thomas, Ipsos's Chief Survey Methodologist, to talk about some additional research and initiatives that we're undertaking to focus on diversity and inclusion here at Ipsos. So just setting the stage, when we think about why we conduct surveys, we're really trying to understand a particular group of interest. Maybe it's our clients or our customers. Organizations might be interested in the opinions and experiences of their employees. Legislators and policymakers might care about their constituents and reflecting the voices or the will of the people. And we're trying to really learn things like the experiences and behaviors of that general population or that population of interest, some of their attitudes and opinions, and maybe even trying to predict their intentions and their future behaviors. And so we collect a survey, we look at the data, we have some research questions in mind that we're interested in understanding better. And so really the quality of that survey that we do affects the quality of the decisions that we make based on what we learned from that study. So if we start with poor quality data, it can really lead to some costly mistakes. It can really make us think that we understand something that perhaps we don't really have a clear picture on. So we could make some poor decisions. And so we really want to make sure that we're starting out with good quality data that's valid and reliable so that we can have confidence that the way that we're understanding our population of interest really leads to well-informed decisions. And if we think about the last 20 years here in the United States, we've seen a real shift in the mode of survey administration And internet surveys are now the most frequently used mode of survey administration. And that's due to kind of a number of different factors. We've seen a decrease in landline penetration here in the United States and a number of households moving to cell phone only. And that makes it harder to conduct random digit dial telephone surveys due to some privacy laws here in the United States. It's not as easy to randomly dial cell phones. It has to happen manually. We've also seen response rates decline on telephones as there's been a proliferation of caller ID technologies. People are less likely to answer phones from or calls from numbers that they don't recognize. And then we've seen an increase in internet penetration throughout the United States over the last 20 years. And that's true with both kind of traditional internet service providers and also then the corresponding increase in people using cell phones, smartphones, as a way to connect to the internet. And we really do see a difference in the types of people who have more of a wired household versus relying on a cell phone for their mobile data plan. And all of that then feeds into the types of people we're able to reach with online surveys. And there are two main types of internet panels. You've probably heard about non-probability based or opt-in panels. These are panels where people volunteer to take surveys. So they either seek out a panel and agree to join it because they're interested in sharing their voice. Maybe they're interested in getting the incentive money for taking the frequent surveys. And it's also the case that a lot of the non-probability or opt-in panel providers, sample providers, will rely on what's called river or intercept sampling. And that's where maybe you're browsing online and you'll see a pop-up come up and that will invite you to take a survey. So they're really trying to engage people who are actively using the internet to try and draw people in to complete surveys. And so typically these types of panels tend to have some biases associated with them. Obviously, they only cover the internet population. So if someone's not online, if someone doesn't ever go online, they're not going to be included in a survey like this. It also seems to be the case that people who join these panels or who take these surveys tend to be a little bit more internet savvy. They're more frequent users of the internet. They're much more interested in technology, adopters of technology, early adopters, and they tend to have greater exposure to media, advertising, and more interest and use in social media than the general population. And so that's the people who volunteer, the non-probability based panels. There's another type of panel called a probability based panel. That's what KnowledgePanel is, and that's an invitation only panel. So in this case, you have to be invited to join the panel. And most of them start with some sort of probability based foundation recruitment. So in the case of KnowledgePanel, it's an address-based sample, and we'll send an invitation to your household. And I'll walk through that a little bit in a couple of slides. And so with a probability-based foundation, that means we're relying on the statistical integrity, statistical theory to build the panel to cover the full population of the United States, and it allows us to draw inferences to the general population. So you tend to get a much more representative sample of people. And actually, in the case of the KnowledgePanel, we go ahead and cover the non-internet population by providing them internet. And I'll tell you how we do that in a couple of slides. So just to give a high level and quick history of the panel, it started actually in the late 90s. Two Stanford professors saw this move towards online surveys. Most of them at the time, they were all non-probability panels. So people were creating these panels of people who were already online. And these Stanford professors decided that they wanted to come up with a way to capitalize on the move to online, but to do it in a way that allowed for the collection of a gold standard survey that was on par with telephone recruitment, RDD surveys at the time. And so they came up with this way to do a probability-based recruitment to an online panel. At the time, they used random digit dialing and called people across the US and asked them if they wanted to join this panel. They did cover the non-internet population. At the time, they provided web TV, if you remember that technology. And so that way they were able to ensure that they covered the full population. The panel very quickly grew to 20,000 members. And then in 2008, it grew even further up to 50,000 members. And that's when we really started to think about what we call KnowledgePanel Latino, where we included some Spanish language recruitment to make sure that we're covering both English speaking and Spanish speaking Hispanics, and really able to cover the Latino Hispanic population with representative samples. In 2009, it's when we switched from the telephone recruitment where the panel started to an address-based sample. And then since then, we've been introducing some refinements to our sampling and our weighting approaches, really trying to pay attention to the quality of samples that we're selecting, the representativeness of the panel, to make sure that we continue to be that gold standard for online surveys. Currently, the panel has 60,000 members from 50,000 households here across the US. And this is a brief overview of our recruitment process. As I mentioned, it starts as an address-based sample. So we use what's called the delivery sequence file from the United States Postal Service. We select a sample of addresses from across the US, and then we mail them an invitation to join the panel. So that has a letter and a brochure that provides some information about the panel, and also includes a $2 incentive, what's called a non-contingent incentive. They get that $2 whether they join the panel or not. And that's just kind of a show of good faith and a way to kind of entice them into joining the panel. There's 3 different modes that they can respond. They can either send a response via the mail, they can go online and tell us that they're interested in joining the panel, or they can call in and tell us that they want to join the panel. And in that way, with the 3 different modes, we're making sure that we're including people who are more or less comfortable with the internet, as well as people who don't have the internet. They can either mail us or call us to tell us that they want to join. And then we do work to convert our refusals, or people who are non-responders. We send them a postcard and a follow-up letter. And then if we're able to match the address to a telephone number, we'll also do some outbound calling to try to recruit them and bring them onto the panel, so that we're really building a panel that does reflect the US population. So this is a little bit about the non-internet households. Internet penetration is pretty high here in the US, but it's not 100%. And so I've included here some statistics from the American Community Survey, some census data, where they asked whether or not households have access to the internet, including both a more traditional internet service provider and via a cell phone or a cellular plan. And so you can see a couple of subgroups in the US where there's a difference in the rate of percentage of people who do not have the internet. So among Black and African Americans, about 15% do not have internet access. 12% of Hispanics do not have internet access, 6% of other race ethnicity, and 8% of white Americans. And then we also see a strong relationship between level of education and internet access. So if you have a college degree or a higher level of education, you're very likely to have a way to connect to the internet. Only 3% of people with the highest levels of education here in the US do not have a way to connect to the internet. Compare that with 23% of people who have less than a high school degree who are not online. And so it's really important for us to make sure that we can capture those voices. And that's why we go through the extra expense and extra hurdle of recruiting non-internet households and providing them with a way to take surveys for us. So what we do now, instead of that web TV technology that I'm not sure exists anymore, we send them a tablet with a mobile data plan. So they get a tablet in the mail, they turn it on, and then we've set it up so that it's very easy for them to connect to the internet, to connect to the panel, to complete surveys. You can see that there's a screenshot there on the right. There's some icons. So there's an icon for the panel member portal. and an email address that we set up for them. So that's ways for them to very easily get into the surveys that are available for them to complete. And so here's a look at some data comparing results from a telephone RDD survey, a KnowledgePanel survey, and then samples from 7 different opt-in providers. This was a study conducted by a couple of professors who wanted to really compare the quality of data across different sample sources. And what they did was they built a questionnaire that had a number of measures from things like the census survey or the National Health Interview Survey, really high quality, gold standard, federally funded surveys, and compared the results from each of these different sample sources to the results of the benchmarks. And you can see that the 2 probability-based samples, the RDD telephone study and the KnowledgePanel sample, were closest to external benchmarks, had the least amount of error or bias. And the opt-in samples all had a higher level of bias. And in fact, they didn't necessarily always agree. So there was great variation or variability in the extent to which they aligned with these external benchmarks. Here's some more recent data looking at the percent of the US population that has tested positive for the coronavirus. So we've been doing a weekly survey with Axios where we ask Americans about their experiences throughout this pandemic, including a question that asks if they've tested positive for the virus. And you can see that the results from that survey showing what percent of Americans have tested positive aligns really closely with CDC data that shows the percent of the US that's tested positive. So we're able to accurately predict the percentage of positive cases here in the United States. And then one last example of the quality of KnowledgePanel data. This is a slightly different topic. It's looking at some religion categories from the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI. And so you can see here some categories that have a mix of both race and religion. So white, non-Hispanic, evangelical Protestant, Black, non-Hispanic Protestant. And I'm comparing the estimate that we get from KnowledgePanel for these groups to the estimate that PRRI has from their telephone survey that they do. And the estimates line up almost exactly, really, really close. On average, it's less than 1 percentage point difference. And that's true even for some really small incidence groups, some small subpopulations here in the US, like Buddhist or Hindu or Unitarian Universalist Americans. And so we've seen a couple of case studies of the quality of the data that we get from KnowledgePanel. Now let's look at how we go about recruiting and maintaining a diverse and representative panel from recruitment all the way through sample study completion. So we'll talk about the different ways that we ensure diversity and representativeness. So starting with recruitment, I mentioned that we send a letter with a brochure to households. All of the material that we send is in both English and Spanish. This is, you can see a picture of the brochure that we currently send to households. So we've translated everything. The interviewers who are on standby waiting for someone to call in to say that they're interested in joining the panel speak both English and Spanish, they're bilingual. And then we do also translate surveys into Spanish. So if someone doesn't speak English well or at all, and they prefer to take surveys in Spanish, that's definitely an option for them. All of our materials are diversity friendly. So we've thought about including a range of faces in our materials, and not just with regard to race, ethnicity, but also age, and really trying to show the diversity of the US in the pictures that we selected for these materials. And then when we think about our address-based sample, we do proactively oversample some households who are harder for us to bring into the panel. So we mildly oversample households that are likely to have a Hispanic resident or a young adult. Young adults are harder for us to get into the panel. We also oversample census tracts with a high concentration of lower education and then rural residents. In that way, we're trying to build the panel to be kind of a mini representation of the United States. And so this is a lot of numbers that I'm showing you, but basically, once we build that panel and we're trying to make it look like the US in miniature, it reasonably aligns pretty well with census demographics. But because there are some of those groups that's harder for us to recruit and retain on the panel, there are a few skews where it doesn't necessarily perfectly align with the census. And so what we do is we've developed this patented sample selection methodology that allows us, enables us to select samples that they themselves are a nice, perfect miniature representation or pretty close to perfect miniature representation of the US. And so I'm showing you here a sample that we selected of a size of 1,000 and comparing the demographics of that sample to census benchmarks across a number of different demographics, so you can see how well that starting sample aligns with the US population. And so I've mentioned a couple times that young folks are harder across the industry to get them to complete surveys. Our starting sample aligns well with the US population. Same with high school or less education. That sample looks nice compared to the US population. We reflect the diversity in terms of race, ethnicity well in that starting sample. And then even looking at some things that are maybe less standard or less common demographics that we would look at, like home ownership. So we have about 33% of the sample that were renters compared to 32% of the population. So that matches up nicely. And even whether or not the panelist was born here in the United States, the starting sample in this case had about 22% compared to 18% for the US population. So we're really selecting samples that do mirror the US population. And then once we have that nice balanced starting sample, we also work really hard to get as many of them to complete a given survey as we can. So on average, our completion or our cooperation rate is about 60%. It can be higher with a longer field period and some additional incentives. Our baseline incentives are pretty minimal for a standard survey. Most panelists get $1 per survey if it's a short survey. There are a couple of groups, our Black panelists and those with less than a high school degree get $2 per survey just to boost those cooperation rates a little bit. And then you can see that the longer the survey is, the greater the incentive just to compensate them for the time that they're spending on taking surveys. We do have a number of different ways to invite them and remind them. I've mentioned that there's a member portal that they can click on that shows what surveys are available in their queue. And then also email invitations. We do send SMS text messages on occasion. That's one way that we can really boost response among our young panelists. It's an effective way to reach out and engage them. And then just thinking about different targeted reminders and incentive combinations to try and mix things up for our panelists. It's not always the same standard canned invitation or reminder. For trying to put something engaging out there to catch their attention and get them to complete the survey for us. And then we also think a lot about our measurement and capturing diversity through measurement. So most of the demographic questions that we ask are aligned with the US Census because that does make it easier for us to weight our studies to make sure that there's no daylight between the way that we measure the demographic in a survey and the benchmark. But we are conducting some research to see if there are better ways. We want to make sure that people are able to really tell us how they identify, even if that doesn't necessarily align with the census, because we don't want to put them in boxes that don't necessarily fit for them. And so one example of that is that we've done a lot of research looking into how to measure gender identity. Right now, the census is limited to the binary measurement of gender, but a lot of people have a non-binary identification, and there's a growing interest in making sure that we're able to capture that in surveys. So we've done a bunch of research based on some work that's coming out of the Williams Institute over in UCLA that allows us to capture gender identity and hopefully more aligned with the way that people think about themselves. So I'm showing you here on the right of the slide the current question that we use to measure gender identity. It's a two-step question as recommended by the Williams Institute. And then we've done a bunch of research on the current gender identity questions. And we've asked people, does this allow you to express your gender identity? And also making sure that it doesn't confuse people who might not be as familiar with terms like non-binary or transgender. And so we found that this measure works really well to capture both cisgender as well as non-binary Americans. So I've mentioned that the starting sample that we have aligns nicely with US population demographics. We do see differential non-response, so there are some groups that just have a little bit of a lower completion rate, even though we work hard to boost the completion rates so that respondent distribution doesn't always exactly align with the demographics of our target population. And so typically we would weight our final study completes to bring them back in line with census benchmarks. And I'm showing you here the typical demographics that we use to weight our final study sample. If there's both English and Spanish survey completes, we add some additional adjustments to make sure that we're reflecting the Hispanic population appropriately. So typically we'll weight on what's called primary language, where we adjust the proportion who are English dominant, bilingual, and Spanish dominant to align with American Community Survey benchmarks, as well as often we will add in a Hispanic origin adjustment to make sure we're accurately capturing the diversity of the Hispanic Latinx population here in the US. And then finally, panel retention. So we've worked hard to bring these people onto the panel, to engage them with our surveys, and we want to retain them. Once we get them in the door, we want to make sure that they stay with us, taking surveys for us, and that we can really capitalize on that investment of bringing them onto the panel and make sure that their voice is reflected in our upcoming surveys. So the ways that we go about increasing retention are to manage and minimize survey burden. So we limit the number of surveys that any one panelist can be assigned in a given week. Typically, our panelists take between 2 and 3 surveys for us in a given month. And that's much lower typically if you ask an opt-in respondent how many times they take a survey in a month. It's usually much higher than that. We do offer additional bonus incentives like sweepstakes or a non-contingent incentive that's kind of a random additional little bit of money that goes into their account just to try to keep them engaged and interested in the panel if we see that they might be likely to attrit or to withdraw from the panel. And then we have a blog that provides some interesting findings. We have emailed respondents to a given study if that study's been published to see, so that they can see kind of the insights that were learned from the survey that they took and the fruits of their hard work and their labor for us. And so all those efforts combined, how well do we do then in recruiting a diverse set of panelists? Here, what I'm showing you is how our panel looks both unweighted and weighted across a number of different demographics, so age, gender, education, income, employment, region of the US, metropolitan status, and marital status, and looking at that within race ethnicity groups here in the US to see how closely do our white panelists, our Black panelists, our Hispanic Latinx panelists, and other race ethnicity, how well do the demographics of each of those groups align with the population demographics? And so unweighted, you can see that white panelists, about 3 percentage point difference compared to population demographics. For Black and Hispanic panelists, it's 5% difference unweighted, and then a 3% difference for other race ethnicity. And then once we go ahead and weight our panel to a number of different census benchmarks, it brings those differences in line with the census, including on some things that we don't wait for. So the adjustments that we're making also work to bring the diversity of these groups of each individual race, ethnicity in line with the demographics of the population of those groups here in the United States. And I wanted to show you what that looks like for a couple of surveys within both our Black African American and our Hispanic respondents. And so this is an example of some results from two surveys, one conducted on KnowledgePanel and one conducted on a non-probability sample. And we're comparing them to, again, to census benchmarks to see how well are we representing the diversity within race ethnicity groups here in the United States. The teal bar is the KnowledgePanel, the gold bar is the opt-in or non-probability sample, and then the dark blue bar is the census data. And I've highlighted in red places where the divergence from the benchmark is greater than 10 percentage points or more. And so you can see overall the KnowledgePanel, even within the Black and African American survey respondents, aligns with census benchmarks with the population, actual true population of the US. There are two places where the opt-in data diverge from 10 percentage points or more. So this shows that the KnowledgePanel is working really well to represent diversity within Black and African American respondents. And then if we look at the Hispanic Latinx, it's a very similar picture. KnowledgePanel aligns really well with the population demographics within Hispanic Latinx respondents, and the opt-in sample is a little bit further off. And so these are on the demographics that we typically think about, demographics that are often weighted for in samples. And so you can see that with, it may extend to other attitudes and behaviors that are not typically measured or where we don't have benchmarks to necessarily compare to. Within these subgroups that are of interest, we may be further off from the actual attitudes, behaviors, intentions of these subgroups of interest. So the closer that we can align demographics, the more assured we can be that these other measures that are actually the reason why we're conducting our survey will reflect the true attitudes and behaviors of these subgroups that are of interest to us. And so overall, we've seen that KnowledgePanel continues to be that gold standard solution that it was set out and designed to be. The quality of the results that we get are in line with other external benchmarks that we have that are probability based. I've showed you the alignment with the CDC data, with the PRRI data, and the study that looked across the average bias across a number of different demographics. Excuse me. The KnowledgePanel is representing the US population in miniature, and not just the online population, but the full population of the US. So that hard work that we put into recruitment of a representative set of voices, it looks like it's paying off. We're seeing the quality and the results of the data that we get. And that means that when we do a study on KnowledgePanel, we can have confidence in the decisions that we're making. And that's true at the aggregate level, as well as if we drill down into some subgroups of interest. We've seen evidence that shows that we're representing those subgroups of interest well with all of those efforts that we go through in terms of recruitment and sampling and weighting to make sure that the survey that we have really does capture the diversity of voices here in the US. And with that, I'll turn it over to my co-presenter, Randall Thomas, who will talk a little bit about some additional work that we're doing in this space to bring diversity and inclusion to the forefront of Ipsos.
Oh, yes, I'm Randall Thomas, Chief Survey Methodologist for Ipsos. There are a number of areas in measurement and respondent friendliness that we have been looking at for a number of years, probably since 2012, 2013. Francis and I have both become interested in increasing the measurement accuracy for gender identity, sexual orientation, and race ethnicity measurement to see how well we could develop categories and questions that would fit better with people and their experience of who they are and their identities. We also, starting in around 2013, became very interested in the use of smartphones for conducting internet surveys. We started seeing more and more people taking surveys online, and we noticed that a lot of the distributions or a lot of the people who were taking the surveys online by smartphone were young, were minorities and blacks and Hispanics, and harder to reach audiences. And we started conducting many studies to figure out what's the best ways of conducting research on a smartphone and design characteristics that will improve the experience for all people, including those who are using their smartphones. And in your window, you'll see that there's a handout you can download on smartphone design that is an essential tool to improve respondent-friendly surveys, to make surveys easier to complete for respondents that are often harder to reach. A few other initiatives that we've been engaged in as well, that we have renewed vigor in terms of developing additional survey research. One is in terms of response patterns. A lot of people have pointed out that people of different groups use response scales differently, and we want to try to ensure that we look at this issue and how it impacts the substantive results we get for our clients and for researchers generally. So we're doing extensive analyses of research patterns or response patterns within the research we've conducted to see if there are better scales, if there are better formats that may work more effectively to represent the diverse voices we have in our samples, whether they're opt-in or they're probability-based. So that's one area of research that is ongoing and that we've done research previously as well. Another area that is continuing in the line of research that we've conducted previously is expanding our interest in measurement of the experience of discrimination, looking at discrimination from a point of view of racial or ethnic minorities, but also gender, as well as sexual orientation, as well as age. So we're looking across a number of different aspects of life, from renting an apartment to buying a house, to your education. We're looking at people's experience with discrimination over a number of different time intervals as well. So that's an active area of investigation that we're expanding in and trying to develop so that we can actually develop a tracker that will help us look at the experience of discrimination in the United States over time as well. So one other area of research that is active. Then going to the next slide, we also are looking at the issues of data cleaning. One of the things that I often get involved in is trying to improve the data quality within our studies. And a lot of times people feel that they can improve the quality through cleaning the data of people who may be responding in suboptimal ways. But what we have found is that those people who respond in suboptimal ways are often the groups that we are most interested in, Blacks, Hispanics, younger folks. And so what we're doing is taking a comprehensive look at what constitutes suboptimal responding. Is it suboptimal responding throughout a survey, or is it occasional throughout a survey? And how would we best clean data so that we improve the accuracy of our data, but not exclude members from diverse communities. So that's also another area that we have launched fairly extensive research in as well, and have done research, and that's previously both Francis and I have been looking at data cleaning issues for the past 5 years. Finally, we're looking at measurement of cultural identity. So we're fielding studies that have looked at aspects of cultural identity, including autonomy versus a collective orientation, among other things, to try to figure out how is the cultural identity best measured with the shortest instruments, and how can that improve our ability to assess for substantive issues by incorporating measures of cultural identity. So those are just sort of the top line summaries of what we are currently engaged in terms of addressing issues of diversity and inclusiveness. I turn it over to Francis next to conclude. Thank you.
All right, so that brings us to the end of the material that we had. We do have time for questions, so feel free to include some questions in the chat box. We do have one question, which is asking if KnowledgePanel uses a quota design for sampling. So Randall, I'll take that question. Actually, KnowledgePanel very rarely uses quotas. Because we have the profile data of our panelists, we know their demographics, we're able to use that patented sampling methodology that I mentioned to select samples that are well balanced. So when you use a quota design, you're pretty limited in terms of how many demographics you can ensure your sample aligns with the benchmarks of the target population. So typically, a quota design might include age, gender, race, ethnicity, and perhaps education or region. But the more demographics you add, the harder it is to fill that sample and make sure you're checking all those boxes. With KnowledgePanel, because we have that profile data on our panelists, we weight our panel to the census benchmarks, as I mentioned, and then use that weight to select a weighted sample. And so in that way, we're able to select those samples that align really well with both the demographics that we weight on, as well as what we saw was a number of other demographics that you don't typically weight on. The samples that we're selecting really do look like the population, and we can do that without a quota design. I think we might be at the end of our time. So if there are questions that we didn't get to, we will certainly email you, but I wanted to thank you very much for your participation and your engagement, and please feel free to reach out to us with any further questions that you may have. So thank you all.
Well, I just really want to thank Francis and Randall for today's really interesting presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I do see some questions now just popping in, some more.
Oh.
So those will be answered by email directly, and also via email you will receive a link to today's recorded presentation. Remember, there is a handout in the webinar console, so please go there for more information. And of course, we welcome the opportunity to speak with you directly, so please feel free to reach out to us. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.